Mindfulness is a word that I'm sure many of you in this room have heard by now. It's the practice of being in the present moment and is now being used by actors, athletes, and motivational speakers alike. But is this all that mindfulness really is? A tool for us to be healthier people? Or can mindfulness also be a space for us to show up as better community members? What is this mindfulness really? I want to take you on a little journey. Let's go beyond the cliche and into the infinite space of mindfulness and meditation. To start, I want to show you how I got here. Walk with me back to October 2017 and picture me, a young, brown-skinned scholar raised in and around communities that practiced mindfulness. I had just gotten the job of my dreams, and I literally couldn't believe that this thing that I had been practicing my whole life, mindfulness, was now so popular. You could find it on magazines, on ESPN, was literally the topic of the year. And my actual day job was teaching people how to be mindful through movement or sitting practices or paying attention to everyday things. I was hyped. Now, let's fast forward to February 2018. I registered to go to my first mindfulness conference, and we all know conferences can be a little bit stuffy, but I just knew this one was going to be different. So I dressed up, I put on my favorite shoes, and I brought my journal with me because I was ready to take some notes. And I walk into the big conference room, and I look around, and I freeze. My jaw drops. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was the only woman of color in the room. In fact, I was the only woman of color in a room where the whole purpose of the conference, mindfulness, was based off cultures and people who were racially and spiritually like me. I was devastated. I didn't know what to do or to say all day, and to be honest, I had to compose myself from crying. That moment, I had to use my mindfulness practices, deep breaths, feeling my feet on the floor so that the emotions wouldn't overtake me. Viktor Frankl said, between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our power to choose our response, and in our response lies our growth and our freedom. Viktor Frankl was a genocide survivor. He knew a lot about the need for spaces. Spaces of power, spaces of resistance, and spaces of community. This moment, looking around the room and being one of no one else, was a space. A mindful pause, a moment for the vines that tugged the millennia of mindfulness from my ancestors and my lineages to hug me tighter. You see, I was rooted in these practices. My communities had planted seeds in me that I had grown all my life by practicing mindfulness. So now, I want to take you back to the roots of mindfulness, because from what you may know about mindfulness and looking at me, you might be a bit confused right now. Well, mindfulness is an ancient practice that goes by many names around the world. In short, it's the practice of using the breath, the body, mantras to be in the here, right now. Mindfulness practices have been a part of our planet and human globe since we have had breath in our bodies. It's universal, inherent in African, Indigenous, and Asian communities. And these global mindfulness practices are inherently equity-based, most of them being rooted in oneness with nature, kinship with fellow human beings, gentle accountability for our actions, and connection with our intangible selves. the parts of us that we might not always see in the mirror, but that we know are there. Yet many people who find themselves in the margins of society don't see themselves in that mirror of mindfulness at all. When I tell people in my communities what I do, most of them feel like I'm speaking about something that they don't have access to, or to be real, that they should have no involvement in. When I work with folks, they tell me that they do mindfulness wrong, or that they're not good at practicing mindfulness. Well, I'll tell you a secret, you can't do mindfulness wrong. But where did this image of a perfect practice, one that's rooted in perfectionism, come from? This perfect practice also makes it seem that if there's only one type of person or one type of path, that's the gold standard. Well, to answer this question, we have to go back to the way that mindfulness was introduced to the West. Now, Western culture is young in comparison to the rest of the world, so it makes sense that we would jump on this contemplative bandwagon a bit late. And when we did, most of the teachers had learned their practices from a Buddhist lens. But the next great phase was to secularize these practices as much as possible so that they weren't connected to any one sort of path. And in doing so, many of the teachings of Buddhism were lost in translation. And in doing so, many of the other mindfulness practices from Indigenous, African, and South Asian cultures weren't even considered. There was a loss of community, a loss of collectivism as a natural part of practicing mindfulness, and there was a loss of connection. Many people feeling that this idea of mindfulness was not for them. So now let's go back to that vision we curated together of that young brown-skinned scholar in higher education. In many rooms, being the only person of color or queer person or person with a neurodivergence or disability in a room. In many rooms, I was the odd one out, not fitting this image of slender, blonde, Lululemon, wealthy. And yet, I wanted to find a place to belong in this community because I knew of mindfulness as a community practice. The mindfulness that so many of the globe did, you either did with community or in some cases for community, even when practicing by yourself. So how could I invite in so many people who had been feeling left out and remind us that these roots are actually global? Well, I want to introduce you to equitable mindfulness. Equitable mindfulness is defined as presenting the concept of mindfulness to everyone while being active in our respective communities, breaking down systemic barriers to inclusive practice. Now, I know those are a lot of words, so let's just simplify equitable mindfulness to this: a practice of mindfulness that you can feel a part of. The framework started as a conversation between my team and I at ASU, and it prompted a shift in the way that we delivered our instructional practices. And it included 3 important tiers that really helped us to ground in the intention of wanting to make sure that everyone could feel like they could be involved. Let's start with the first tier. Mindfulness can act as a way of protection. This tier is mostly for my friends in the margins, and it helps you to settle and to choose when you feel like things are out of your control. To choose joy or compassion, or anger and sadness. So the next time you feel like you're in a situation where you need to settle and choose, I want you to think about what you can control. And remember, you can control this breath. And by taking that breath, you can control your choice. The next tier is about sustainability. Now, many of us, if not all of us, in this room know about being stressed. And we know that stress isn't just a one-time thing, that all of the stressors in our lives can build up and to cause us to feel burned out. Whether we're parents or teachers, restaurant servers, construction workers, or engineers, most of the time we're doing something in these roles that help us to serve other people. So, how do we show up more grounded so that we can sustain this outpouring of love? Well, doing practices like meditation, breath work, dance, ceremony, they can help to give us rest and rejuvenation. But also, being in the moment as you and your grandmother make her famous mac and cheese at the next family reunion. Oh, this is mindfulness too. It's about showing up and being in the moment so that you can be in more moments longer. And the final tier is about creating programming with the global population in mind. Now, this tier might be the most important as we talk about unmasking the magical meaning of mindfulness. Because if the conference that I had gone to had embodied the idea that this is for everyone, I wonder how different my experience would have been. If the presenters had looked around and the organizers had looked around and said, you know what, we need to make sure we're including as many people from around the globe as possible, how enchanting would that experience have been? This tier is about planting seeds of joy, of compassion, but most importantly, seeds of we, not me. And because sometimes in nature, seeds don't grow, they don't always get the watering or the sunlight that they need. This tier is also about calling people in and holding them accountable. So now, with these three tiers firmly holding this idea of equitable mindfulness, the community came together and we wrote and we practiced and we shared our stories around mindfulness. And then I used these concepts to bring other people together. Communities that society tells us shouldn't sit down and talk to one another. Equitable mindfulness gave space for the conservative church mom from the south of the US to sit down and speak with the queer, BIPOC, voguing queen. And in that space, they could see each other, if only for a moment. Because between stimulus and response, there's a space that we can create together. And since equitable mindfulness is a community practice, I'd like to invite each of us in this room to take 3 breaths in and out together, holding space and giving space, as we remember that this breath is for you too. So I invite you to close your eyes. Breathe in, out, in, out, and in, and out. Thank you very much.